Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Sharby Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support on the recent content. We have a lot planned for 2024, so stick around for that. And before we get started with today's episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates. As promised, we will be reading out comments from our most recent TikToks and videos and shorts and stuff like that. So if you want a chance to be featured just like the comment we're about to read, please just comment. And it could be anything, your thoughts, just something. And the one we've chosen to read today is from Gianni Artiaga from TikTok saying, LeBron be coaching more than Darvin at this point, with the crying emoji. So pretty funny stuff. I mean, I'm not going to lie. There's some truth to that because I think, LeBron does, he is a great leader and whatnot. I think he's one that the players like to follow for sure. So I think there is some truth to that. But yeah, pretty funny comment. But yeah, but on the other hand, it's not serious at all. But like I said, some pretty funny stuff. And oddly enough, it's the perfect segue into our first topic today, involving another coach who players seem to be calling out a little bit. So I'll let you, kind of introduce who that is.
Yeah, so we'll start with, a team that we've talked about multiple times this season that we're going to continue to talk about, the Golden State Warriors. So,
Yes, sir.
They had a game against the Denver Nuggets, a game in which it was kind of interesting because this was a game that we were sort of talking about in our last episode because I think it was ongoing as we were recording.
Yeah.
And it was around halftime, and the Nuggets were up. I believe it was 70-63. And then in the third quarter, Golden State had a 44-point third quarter, and basically went from being down by 7 to being up by 15 or whatever. And then in the fourth, they got up even more, where eventually Golden State went up by as much as 18. They had an 18-point lead in the fourth. Denver quickly whittled that back down. It was a tie game. Golden State basically couldn't score, couldn't get stops. Pretty much what we've seen a lot from them, over the course of the season, right? They're a team that, tends to, for whatever reason, always be in close games. They're 14-14.
Right.
In crunch time, which that's almost every game basically. So every game is basically down to the wire, and it's a 50% chance of whether or not they win or lose. And they ended up losing this one right at the buzzer. Jokic pulls up over Kevon Looney basically from the logo, kind of banks it in. Don't remember if he called glass or not.
Yeah.
Really doesn't matter. But it
doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. And then went in, and the Nuggets won 130-127 as the Warriors lost again. And interestingly enough, during the final, I believe, 18 minutes of the game, somebody who was starting didn't play to close the game. He only played 19 minutes, and that was Jonathan Kuminga, which was interesting, right? After the game, Steve Kerr talked about his reasoning for not playing him, right? This is a guy that's been starting in place of Draymond, who appears to be on his way back, being reinstated from what was considered a 12-game suspension. He just has to be physically cleared, so he should be back in about a week. But basically, at the end of the game, he talked about, we were closing. Wiggins was out there. He was playing relatively well, so we wanted to have him out there, whatever. Then less than 12 hours later, basically, a story comes out from Shams Charania with Kuminga basically saying, or I guess basically telling Shams Charania that he does not feel like he can succeed under Steve Kerr anymore, basically, right? So kind of like saying trade me without actually saying trade me in a way, right? Obviously, they're not gonna fire Steve Kerr, even though, again, he's a guy where his name has come up a lot. And like I said, I don't think he's done a great job, but I also, similar to Ham, I think it's just also kind of hard when you just don't know necessarily what you're going to get, night to night from your players. And also, you also, one of your other guys is out because he just, for whatever reason, can't control his emotions.
Yeah.
But it is interesting with Kuminga because, again, you can understand both sides. Because from Kuminga's perspective, right, this is his third season. This is finally his opportunity to start getting some minutes. He's been playing well, taking advantage of it. But then he doesn't close in a game that they probably could have, used him out there to win. Not that he would have gotten help to get any stops, but at the very least, you could see he could get downhill, and be a threat at the rim just because of how athletic he is.
Sure.
And I also understand because, next season is the last year of his rookie deal. So he's going to have to find a way to get paid. And if he's kind of just sitting on the bench for most of his time in Golden State, it's going to be kind of hard for him to get paid. So I understand that. And then from Steve Kerr's perspective, right, he's just looking for ways to win. He's kind of been, I guess, relying on his veterans a lot of times, even if they don't always come through. He also mentioned during my entire career, I was always unhappy with my minutes. So, like I said, I get it. I understand. Both
Yeah, that's a
sides. Because
wild quote.
also, again, when you're losing games, it's not really fun. Then funny enough, right, on the second night of their back-to-back against the Pistons, right, he ended up playing the most minutes of any Warrior.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden he says, I love it here. They had a discussion. And they're currently, playing the Raptors. It's halftime and they're down by almost 30 points at halftime. So don't necessarily know if
Tough.
that worked. But yeah, but regardless, um, I don't know. It's just kind of an interesting thing because again, like I said, I think he's been playing well. But then you also wonder, like, even a guy like a Moses Moody, right? He was playing earlier in the season. Then all of a sudden he's no longer playing at all. I think he's playing in the Raptors game because we hadn't even mentioned it, but
Yeah.
they've been hit just as soon as Draymond comes back, they get hit with some bad news for someone else. Chris Paul,
Yeah.
unfortunately, is going to be out for at least 4 to 6 weeks
Yeah, it's not
with
good.
a fractured hand injury, which is not great because he's been, kind of a part of their second unit, although he's been starting as of late.
Yeah.
Um, so that's rough. So, they've been hit with a lot of rough news in the last few days or so. And, it doesn't get any better with the Kuminga thing, obviously. I mean, again, we'll see where it goes from here. I mean, he's going to play. And it kind of ties in, to our next topic, which we'll get into in a minute. But, what was your take on this? Because, again,
Yeah.
I mean, it obviously, coming off of a loss, right? Like, you knew something was probably coming just because, again, it was like so obvious. Like, why isn't he out there?
Right.
Then at the same time, like this is something that had been bubbling for a while, right? This isn't like a one game where he's like, he's just unhappy now because he's had stretches earlier in the year where he would either sometimes play a lot or just sometimes not play. But, what was your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, he's what? He's still 21 years old, I think, and I think he was taking number 7 or something like that in like 2021. So, his career is just pretty much getting started, which is wild. And I think, this season is probably the most that we've seen from him and the best I think that we've seen from him. I think, given the opportunities, which are kind of weird because it's been up and down. Like you said, he was made the full-time starter, I think, back in early December, but then and that was when due to Draymond. But then in those 11 starts, he looked, I thought, very good. And I think, if you're the number 7 pick, I think you should be guaranteed an opportunity to prove yourself and show what you've got on the court. It's weird. I know, like, now it seems like the trust has eroded, but then it seems like they're also running damage control with what you were talking about. Oh, yeah, I love it here. It's like, okay, you clearly didn't if you were, talking to
Right.
the media about stuff and, letting stories like that leak. But that doesn't really bother me because I think, he's in the right here. If you're like I said, if you're the number 7 pick, I think you really do deserve a chance to prove yourself. And I think, he adds a lot to this team. I know the problem, and the big problem is I think Wiggins and Kuminga do not play well together. I think their stats together have been very horrible. I think Kerr has even said that. Their numbers are not good together, frankly. I think he said that last month. So it's tough to kind of balance out a guy who's not playing well at all and then a young guy whose game doesn't mesh with that guy either. So I do understand that there is somewhat of a issue in terms of personnel. And like you were saying, that kind of ties back to what we were talking about with the Lakers last episode. The personnel, it's kind of hard when you don't know who's going to go off any given night and who's not really going to be a factor in the game at all. So I think they do have some stuff to work on. But I think the best case scenario probably be a Kuminga trade, honestly. I think you should probably move on from him because it seems like they're underutilizing him. I think he would be so much better with a change of scenery. And yeah, it's kind of tough, but I think he has a lot of value because he's such a big wing. So I think you can either get away with keeping him and maybe letting him develop, even though we already know the Warriors have some questionable development with their young guys, I think. Even Moody is in the mix here, so it's kind of tough. But like I said, since he is one of those wings that has some decent defensive features, but can also be a freak athlete and seems to be developing somewhat of a shot, I think it would be interesting to see, if they do give him a change of scenery and he can blossom into, what I think a lot of people thought he would be coming out of the G League Ignite.
Yeah, this season, he is shooting 27
Yeah.
3. I mean, but he is shooting 57 from the field, 13 points, 4 rebounds. I mean, yeah, that's kind of where it sort of feels like I think it's headed, just only because again, then you got to factor in now that Draymond's coming back. Maybe he comes off the bench early on just because like he doesn't want to ruin, whatever the rhythm or flow is.
Yeah.
And you probably need to get back into conditioning. But obviously at a certain point he's gonna start, right? Like he's
Sure.
not gonna continue to come off the bench, and then that means less minutes for Kuminga. Um So it almost kind of feels like he's kind of like getting ahead of it, maybe.
Hmm.
And again, like there probably is a reason to kind of start facilitating something because, again, now you're without Chris Paul. You know, until I mean, if it's 4 to 6 weeks, right, then that's not until after the trade deadline. Um, and again, just because it's 4 to 6 weeks, that doesn't mean he'll be back in 4 to 6 weeks.
Yeah,
I mean, it
that's
could,
minimum.
but you just never know. Sometimes you just, especially with those type of injuries, and again, this is kind of the issue with him where he tends to, pick up these type of injuries a lot where it's like, he's probably going to be out for longer than that. So who knows if he even comes back, until like March or something like
Right.
that. So, I mean, this is kind of a situation where you kind of have to do something because again, like, it's just not good to necessarily be in these type of positions where, you have a lot of players on the team, but they're kind of in a tier where a lot of them are decent but not necessarily great at this point. Because
Sure.
again, even a guy which we talked about going into the season, right? We thought this was going to have to be a big season for guys like a Clay, or a Wiggins, or even some of those other guys like a Kuminga or Moody, because without Jordan Poole, you have to make up for some of the scoring elsewhere.
Sure.
Um, again, you're just not right because again with Clay, we've already talked about it at different points, right? Like he's been playing better as of late, but still not necessarily where you would like him to be. I think personally, especially in comparison to how he finished last year, and then obviously Wiggins, again we don't have to keep talking about that, but
Yeah.
he's not necessarily played
It's
great
tough.
either. Yeah, so and then again, like that's the problem, right? You got like rookies playing better than veterans. You got some young guys who aren't rookies that want more playing time that aren't getting them, right? Because like, say like Jonathan Kuminga and Moses Moody, right? Like those are guys that have been on the team for like 3 seasons, and then like say like a Brandon Pajemski and a Trace Jackson Davis, they're rookies,
Right.
but they've pretty much been consistent playing in the rotation, for a while, whereas those guys were kind of in and out at different points. So I can understand the frustration from everybody, but it's kind of like what you and I said. It's just when you don't have consistent talent every night, you just don't necessarily always know who you can put out there.
Yeah.
I mean, like that one, I guess, is kind of obvious. We're like, yeah, you should have just probably kept Kuminga in there. I don't really know what the reason. I
Yeah.
mean, he said it, but I don't even know if I really buy it. I don't know. But either way, I just feel like it's another one of those things where you're just probably going to have to, like you said, make a trade and then find a way to consolidate some of that talent on the roster because there's some guys on the roster that I think are good, where they can help your team, especially with these guys coming off the bench. But then at the same time, you have a number of other guys where, you probably, just if you could replace them with somebody that's a little bit better or more consistent, then you could be in a better spot. But again, they have to do something because, right, because I think they're what, 10th or whatever in the Western Conference. So they're basically right on the cusp of, the end of the play in.
Yeah. They're 17
It's
and
kind of,
18
yeah,
as of this
exactly. So
recording.
right. So, that's the rough part. So you got to, but again, this is where we're getting to the point in the season where there's basically a month before the trade deadline. So now we're going to start, hearing a lot more rumors, about trades, which kind of
Sure.
brings us into the next topic in a way where you have that weird Pascal Siakam story, right? Where, Shams Charania puts out, that the Kings are, kind of like serious, contenders for, trading for Pascal Siakam. And usually when he puts out something like that, that usually kind of suggests or implies, that it's probably about to happen, right? Like, normally you don't put something out like that and it's just like, oh, this could happen, this might
Right.
happen. Like you see the word serious, like from either Woj or Shams, that means it's pretty close. But then not long after that, right? Then he put out like, oh, now the trade talks are off, right? So maybe there was a scenario where maybe he put out something too early and maybe one of the teams were bugged by it. Um, who knows, right? And then then you had a story not long after that where it was like, oh, Kuminga, right? The Warriors don't want to trade him in a deal for Pascal Siakam. So, we'll see. But it is kind of interesting where like now the Raptors have in theory been playing better, as of late. Maybe they talk themselves into keeping Siakam, but then like if you're
Hmm.
the Kings, um, then you kind of wonder, what do we do here, right? Because they played against the Raptors, funny enough, on that same day, and they ended up winning. But then, like not long before we got on to record, right, they got absolutely demolished, by New Orleans, right? And we had talked about that may just be a team that's not a great matchup for them.
Sure.
Um, but either way, it is just something that's kind of intriguing, only because we've been hearing, for a while, right, about the idea that like, oh, the Kings, probably need to make some type of upgrade, to their roster, right? Because again, we've talked about it before, where what is your ceiling, with those two guys? Not that those two guys are bad, but ideally you'd like to have, a third guy that's like an intermediate between those two guys, right? Like probably a guy that's, as good or better than Sabonis.
Yeah.
And then, you have Fox or whatever, and then you can have like kind of like a big three-esque grouping. So I do kind of wonder, if that's what end up happening, we're like, okay, they said that, maybe they're kind of salty, but then eventually they do a deal later. I just don't know, because with the Kings, if you're not giving up Keegan Murray, then it's basically just a bunch of like the Kings, role guys, right? Like Harrison Barnes, Kevin Herter, guys like that. And like if you're the Raptors, I mean, that feels like that'd be kind of like selling low on Siakam, especially when you consider you got back, RJ Barrett and Emmanuel quickly for, OG Anunoby. So I guess for Siakam, I guess, it's kind of a similar factor where he's got that player option or whatever. He's in the last year of his deal. So, like, unless he signs an extension, you risk the possibility of him leaving as a free agent. Although I
Right.
would probably assume if you trade for him, then you're kind of like having some sort of under the table agreement that, like, all
Yeah.
right, we're going to
It's
trade
going to be
you and then
mutual.
yeah, and take care of you in the
Yeah.
off season. But I don't know. I mean, what do you think? I mean, like, because do you feel like the Kings are the best, I guess situation for him? Because I know we talked about other teams, before that we think, could be a possibility, right? Like, Chris Haynes mentioned that, that Golden State could be like a dark horse, but then at the same time, it feels like, there's a lot of buzz behind the Sacramento thing, but then it was shut down relatively quickly. So what do you think? Are you buying that the deal talks are kind of like over, or do you think they'll revisit it? And then he ends up going there, or just what are your thoughts on all this? Because it was just kind of interesting, just the back and forth that we got.
Yeah, I mean it's tough. Like if we look at where they are in the standings, they're sitting at 14 and 21. Not the worst. Could be a lot better, but like you said, they lost one recently, but they have been playing better as of late. 4 and 6. In their last 10 games. So I do understand if they do want to keep Siakam, but at the same time, like if we're looking at the Kings' perspective, I don't really understand it because it's tough. I think it would be really odd. I think to be paying Siakam a max deal and then also be paying De'Aaron Fox and Sabonis a max deal. I feel like you could probably get somebody better on a max contract than Pascal Siakam. I don't know, and I just don't really know if that kind of fits like their play style. I'm not sure. I've heard like a lot of interesting things like Dallas, apparently, like you said, the Warriors. And then, but it's just hard because I think a lot of these teams, like, they have to give up some young guy that's like really, like, has a lot of potential. Like I heard with the Hawks, it's like they don't want to, they're unwilling because of Jalen Johnson. And it's like, okay, I understand that. Like, you don't want to mortgage your future or anything for a guy who might not even get you out of the first round, that kind of deal. So I do understand it's tough. I think Indiana would be an interesting one. I'm not sure what they would be able to give up. I'm sure it would have to be a young guy as well. I think Dallas would be really intriguing. I think that's the main one that I'd be looking at because I think, they are kind of like one of those teams I think that the NBA trade market is a little bit focused on, as well as Toronto. I think Toronto for sure is one of those because, like we said, they already made one big move. So I think they've already, checked off one of the boxes with Anunoby. And I think the last one is Siakam. I think he will be moved. It's just a matter of where. I'm not sure. It's so tough because all these young guys are, I guess Toronto would want those young guys to be a part of the packages, but Golden State doesn't want to give up Kuminga. And like I was talking about with Jalen Johnson, like they just don't want to give up these premier young guys, and I do understand it. So it's hard. I'm just not really sure. But I
Yeah,
think Dallas would definitely be the best one because I think at the 4 spot, that's probably where they do need somewhat of an upgrade.
yeah. I guess the question is, for Dallas, like, they do have young guys, and then they would have to, package up some of the, I guess, veteran contracts, right? Like
Sure.
Tim Hardaway Jr. or I guess who's another guy like on a random contract? I
I
guess
don't
like a
know.
Rashawn Holmes or somebody like that. But
Yeah,
then it's like, is Toronto interested in that? I guess
I don't
that's
think
kind of the
so.
question. And like you said, then you also have to factor in, fit wise, that's kind of a random big three in a way where it's like, none of them are like great outside shooters. I know De'Aaron Fox, has improved from three,
Yeah.
this year. Obviously, he's at his best, kind of like attacking the basket. I mean, I think he's
Yeah.
shooting like 39. percent from three or whatever. It's probably changed because I know he had a horrible game against
Yeah.
New Orleans. But either way, regardless, um, that's just something that's kind of interesting. But then I guess you could factor in if he's actually an improved 3-point shooter and it translates to the postseason, right? Then some of those issues are kind of, I guess, maybe
Yeah.
kind of mitigated, I guess. But then at the same time, then with Siakam, he's not necessarily a great 3-point shooter either. He's been shooting much better, from three as of late, but like, his 3-point percentage still gone up, I guess, to 29%, so like he had a stretch where, like in the last 5 games, right? He's 2 of 5, 2 for 2, 5 for 8, 1 for 2. That's fine. But still, like, is that really what he is, right? Is he closer to like, I guess in most of those games you're talking about close to 40%, like 40%. I don't think he's a 40% 3-point shooter.
Mm-mm.
But is he better than 28? And then like Sabonis, he's not really comfortable taking outside shots. So I guess that's kind of where you sort of have to like make up for it by just pairing shooters around them. But like you said, that is kind of a weird big three where it's like you're paying three guys max contracts, but how many people view all those guys as like bona fide max players? You know what I mean? Like, not that they're bad or anything, but if those three guys are your main guys, is that quite good enough to be able to, contend in the Western Conference? And it could be. I guess you'd be better defensively for the Kings, and that's kind of been their Achilles heel for the most part. And you just have a more consistent third option. Um, but again, it kind of depends on what you're giving up for him, right? Because like if you're giving up,
Yeah.
Keegan Murray and other guys, right? Then it's an upgrade, but still probably not quite enough because then you lose some of the other depth pieces. But then if you gave up, like Harrison Barnes and Kevin Herter, right? There are other guys on the roster that can kind of make up for that. Then you're probably cooking with something.
And like
So
for Toronto's perspective, like what do you think they would be looking for? Because I think they're looking for more so young difference making talent, like
right,
young impact players that will help you in the here and now somewhat.
right,
But then like they don't want draft picks. I don't think that's what they're looking for. You know what I mean?
right. Because you look at the OG Anunoby deal, and they only got one pick, and that was the second round pick. It wasn't a first. It wasn't even a
Right.
protected first. It was a second.
Right.
The real highlight of the deal was that you got back R.J. Barrett and Emmanuel quickly, and those are
Yeah.
two guys that they're young, but they're kind of more established-ish players where, they're not like guys that nobody knows, where it's like you're kind of just taking a flyer on them. They're guys that, people already kind of know are like solid players.
Yeah.
So, like you said, if that's what Toronto's looking for, then that's where some of those teams it may be a little bit tough
It's
because the
complicated.
Kings, I don't really think they have those type of guys.
No.
Um,
I think they do in Keegan
aside from
Murray,
guys, yeah, aside
but they
from
don't want to
Keegan
give up
Murray,
with him. I don't think
yeah,
they want to give up on him.
yeah, exactly. And then with the Warriors, right? Like I guess they have those guys, with Kuminga or like a Moody.
Yeah.
They're not, I guess, quite the same as those other guys.
Right.
Just because guys have been bigger parts of other teams, but still, that's where it makes more sense. And then then you go back to Dallas, but then they kind of have a similar issue to Sacramento, where like their younger guys aren't quite as established. They're more so
Right.
like young project-ish players, sort of. So I mean, we'll see, but like you said, I do kind of agree with you where I feel like he gets moved. But then you just never know with Toronto because there could just be a world where like they are just better, post Anunoby trade. And then maybe, Siakam feels like decent enough where it's like, oh, well, this is a team now that I don't mind, sticking around and re-signing
Sure.
with, right? Like they give me the most money. But then at the same time, what's the ceiling with this Toronto team? I just don't know. It clearly feels like they're better, but at the same time, how much better? Is it better enough to be able to, compete with other teams in the Eastern Conference? Or is it just better enough that you're not like, a bottom tier play-in team?
Right.
Like, I don't know. Because again, we've seen improvement. Because again, it's
Agreed.
like you got two guys for one guy. Even though that one guy that you sent out is probably the best player, you brought in two other guys who can still play and help you contribute. Like you said, that kind of goes back to what Toronto seems to be looking for, right? Because I think last year it felt like that they were really looking for picks,
Yes.
because we heard like, oh, they want like 2, 3, 4,
It's just
5,000, over 9,000
unrealistic.
picks for OG
It's
Anunoby, but
unrealistic, man.
yeah, but they ended up not even getting one. So, which I
Yeah.
think makes sense because again, like he's good, but is he a guy worth giving up 4 firsts? Especially when we saw, what happened in these last couple of seasons where it was more so stars, that were going for multiple firsts. Then some of these teams realized maybe we shouldn't have done that. Like
Yeah.
Minnesota, maybe they'll be fine anyways. But say like, we'll get into it in a minute. Say like Atlanta, right? They gave up 3 firsts for DeJounte Murray. Hasn't necessarily panned out so far. So,
Right.
uh, we'll see. But like you said, I do think he gets moved. I don't know. Sacramento feels like that could be where it ends up happening. But then again, it's like, I don't know. It just kind of depends. Because like I said, Shams put out there basically that was what was going to happen. And then he was like, oh, now it's not going to happen. The deal is off. So I don't know.
Yeah, he
But
got baited again.
yeah, we'll see. Because you never know. Because another random team, could just kind of jump in that we haven't even necessarily thought about, and
Very
could
true.
just be like, hey, we'll take him. And then they just kind of go rolling with it. But I think if he's going to get traded, it would probably make more sense for him to go to a team where if you get him, then you have a real chance to contend, right?
Yeah.
Like I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense for him to go to a team that's like a little better than Toronto, but not by much,
Sure.
versus versus like if it was like a team, like I said, like a Golden State or maybe a Dallas. What do you think about like before we get into the next one,
Yeah.
what do you think about like Indiana, potentially? Is
That was
that
one
like
that
a
I talked about. Yeah.
team? But then it's like, if are they like a Pascal Siakam away from being, like a contending team in the East? But then at the same time, you got to factor in, you are getting more talent, and you don't necessarily have to look at every trade from the perspective of, does this win us a title? Sometimes you can look at it as, does this make us better, or at the very least, does this give us a chance? Right?
Right.
Like, if you're Indiana, I mean, I guess this is probably jumping the gun just a little bit,
Hmm.
but I guess like asking you, let's say if Indiana traded for Pascal Siakam,
Okay.
gave up, whatever pieces they needed to give
Okay.
up, whichever guys, maybe you throw in like a Jarius Walker,
Okay.
um, a Buddy Hield or
Okay.
whomever, right? Like if you did something like that, right, and you got Siakam and you didn't have to give up the moon to get him,
Hmm.
right? Like, are you in the mindset of like, okay, Indiana has a chance, or is it just like it's a better foundation and then you can kind of build off of that and then continue to ascend?
I think it would kind of be a little bit of both. I think the chance would go up extremely because I think we all know Halliburton's doing some crazy stuff, like no BS. He's actually doing some wild stuff. So it would be intriguing to see him, with another star. I think that would be probably the main thing that they would be looking at is like, okay, let's see, what Halliburton looks like if we pair him with a guy that's, maybe a little bit under him in terms of caliber at the moment. But then like, at the same time, it's like, okay, he's not the best outside shooter in terms of Siakam.
But
Does he
you have
fit?
some pretty good 3-point shooting around him, though.
Exactly.
If
So
yeah, in Indiana.
he could be a focal point of that offense where it's like, he could become an easy backdoor cutter, all kinds of stuff. I think it would be interesting to look at. And that's why I was talking about Indiana. I was like, Indiana would probably be an interesting option as well alongside Dallas. But I think Siakam probably needs to be by a playmaker. So I think it would help them. And I mean, Indiana's sitting at 20 and 15. I think it would help them win more games. It's just in the playoffs. Would it translate? I don't know, because it seems like defensively, Indiana's still kind of just meh, even though they do seem to have been getting the best of the Bucks, which is another interesting storyline, which is kind of contributing to why I think the Bucks are still frauds. But regardless, I think with Indiana, getting Siakam would definitely help them for sure. I just don't know if it would help them get out of the first round or even the second round or something like that.
Yeah, I guess again, if you can get him and you don't have to give up like a ton, then yeah, you do it, because if you do
Hmm.
it, it probably makes you better because you
Yeah.
have more upper tier talent, and Indiana has a decent amount of talent. Some guys that aren't even really playing a whole lot, but
Right.
um, we'll see. But I do think, I will say, like I said, I think Spicy P will be traded. We have a
Agreed.
month because again, as we get to this point, we'll be talking about these type of things a lot more because way more of these rumors will be coming
So
out.
what trade deadline's February 8th, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
February
Okay.
8th, and we are gonna do a live stream,
Yes.
react to, all the trades going on, because the trade deadline normally ends around 3 p.m. So we'll probably start at like, I guess, probably like noonish or
Yeah.
something like that. So, there may be some trades before that, but usually the trades don't pick up until the last couple hours.
Yep.
Because if you've been through this before, which you probably have if you're followed the NBA like we do,
Yeah.
so. Um, then I guess, we can get to the next story, and that's the Atlanta Hawks, right? So according to Mark Stein, right, the Hawks, kind of see themselves or trying to position themselves as sellers basically at this point, for the trade deadline, which is kind of interesting, right? Because, we talked about the Hawks in the offseason where we liked, some parts of the roster.
Hmm.
We thought it might be better than they were last year, mainly because addition by subtraction. You sent out John Collins, and maybe the rest of the roster fits better than it did before, but just hasn't worked, right? The Hawks, regardless, I mean, you look at them in the standings, right? They're 14 and 20. They just lost to the Magic earlier today, so I guess 14 and 21 in overtime. They had an absolute terrible showing against the Pacers where they gave up 150 and basically almost at one point were down by almost 50 points. It's just I don't know. I'm surprised that the Hawks are as bad as they are. I mean, the Chicago Bulls now are better than the Atlanta
Yeah.
Hawks. Which is something I didn't really expect, right? And a lot of that was without Levine. He just recently came back, but still, um, the Hawks are a bad team right now, so it kind of makes sense, to probably move on from some of these guys. He mentioned some names, essentially, Dejounte Murray, Bogdan Bogdanovich, Clint Capella, as well as DeAndre Hunter. So he basically said that the Hawks look to probably build around Jalen Johnson and Trey Young, or excuse me, Trey Young and Jalen Johnson. Jalen Johnson, right, is the third year guy, right, out of Duke.
Hmm.
Who has had a breakout season so far, right, averaging 15 and 8, 3 assists, 58 from the field, 40 from three. Really good passer, playmaker, and really good defender, rebounder, right? Nobody really saw that coming, I think, from him,
Right.
right? Again, he was looked at as an okay player, but
Hmm.
the fact that has been as good as he's been, I think is kind of a surprise. Um, but either way, I guess like you said, he's a young player and he's one of their best players, right? But then at the same time, I guess you might as well if you're the Hawks because I mean, again, you're not really winning, and you don't really, and there's a certain point where you're not going to have your picks. I think they have their picks this year and maybe next year, but I know they have 3 first rounders that they gave to the Spurs in that Dejounte Murray trade, which looks better and better for the Spurs by the
Yeah.
day. And it's kind of interesting with DeJounte Murray, right? Because you look at his, numbers, right? He's averaging 21, 4.5 rebounds, 5 assists, 47 from the field, 39 from three. So the efficiency's there, right? He's shooting better from three, but then at the same time, his defensive impact hasn't really been the same this season,
It's
right?
been
Point of
horrible.
attack. It's not really been good. As a matter of fact, a lot of people who cover the Hawks have mentioned that, at times Trey Young has honestly, kind of played better defense at different points than DeJounte Murray. Not that Trey Young's been good, but
Right.
it sounds like that Trey Young has been better this season on the defensive end, whereas DeJounte Murray has taken a huge step back from what he was in San Antonio, and maybe that might be and I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's like the roster. Maybe if you're playing next to Trey Young, you'll look worse defensively. But then it's like Trey Young's been playing better
Yeah.
defensively.
I think it's an
Um, you know,
accountability thing. I think San Antonio held him accountable on defense, system
right,
wise.
and that's the other thing. Yeah, is it maybe just that San Antonio the system defensively, made up for whatever he's not quite as good at defensively. Maybe
Hmm.
San Antonio was a better spot for him to hide those issues, and now that he's kind of in the spotlight as like, okay, you're our primary absolute defender on a lot of these guys, right? Maybe it's not working quite as well. Because again, I haven't watched the Hawks a ton this season because to be honest, it's kind of an ugly team to watch at
Yeah.
times. But at the same time, I was kind of trying to dig in and, kind of look at, in some of the numbers and research because again, I've heard a lot about how his defense hasn't been as good. And, I'm just kind of curious, to know the reasons why. If there were Hawks fans that could comment below,
Yeah.
about
Please
why,
let us know. It's a
what the
mystery.
issue. Yeah, it's a mystery because again, he was a good defender in San Antonio. His
It's an
rebounding is
all
down.
NBA defender. All defensive
Yeah,
team, whatever.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're right. He was. And I know his rebounding is down. I mean, there are other rebounders on the team. So I mean, like, that's not like Clint Capella and Jalen Johnson are good rebounders for their positions. So obviously, he's not going to get the same. He doesn't have to crash the glass like he
Right.
did in San Antonio. But I just wonder because again, maybe he might look better on another team where like, let's say, Mark Stein, he's mentioned teams like I think it was Philly and LA, right? As potential destinations or teams that are interested in him. And maybe he'll look better in those situations just because he'll be behind, some other guys that, but then at the same time, you would think at the very least, the defense would kind of show up, in some of these stats, but it just hasn't. So I do kind of wonder if we'll see the same defensive impact we saw for the Spurs, if he gets moved elsewhere. Um, And then, so, I guess, like I said, yeah, kind of just tell me what you think about the DeJounte Murray thing, and then we'll get into the other
Yeah.
players and then eventually kind of decide, which guys are most likely to, get moved into where. So,
Yeah.
let us know about the DeJounte thing because it's kind
Well,
of an interesting story, I think.
yeah. Well, I mean, in his 2021-22 season, I think that was obviously his best career of basketball for sure. And I think, this is kind of interesting. I think the problem is, number one, he's playing out of position. I don't like him playing the two. I know that a lot of times he ran the one a lot in San Antonio. He was averaging 9 assists and 8 rebounds. Like he was kind of like that do it all kind of guy. And he also played defense. And I think that's why Atlanta bought into him. But at the same time, you already got Trae Young. And I guess they tried to convert him to a shooting guard, which I guess has somewhat worked out because, I mean, the scoring is still there, but the other stuff is down, which is kind of what you would expect if you're playing, with Trae Young, who's one of the best facilitators in the league. So I do understand what the thought process was, but I think, they just kind of have to admit that it was an L and just take the L. You mortgage somewhat of your future to get a guy who was supposed to be a win now move, and you aren't winning any games. So at that point, you kind of just have to give up on it and take the best deal. That's what I would say. That's the best advice that I could give. Is like just take what's available because I'm not sure who's really also going to be buying in. I don't know what the asking price is going to be for a guy like DeJounte Murray. I'm sure they're going to try and recoup some sort of draft compensation, but at the same time, they could just buy in and get some young talent, kind of like what Toronto's trying to do. But for them to have slipped below Chicago, it's very disappointing. And I just think the Hawks in general, like it's really tough. Quinn Snyder hasn't looked amazing. Trae Young, I think he's looked pretty good at times. I think underrated at times, but also questionable as well. The defense is still a very glaring issue, and I don't think that'll ever change. But I think DeJounte Murray is a big part of why this team is not playing the best because I think, looking at the stats, yeah, it's cool on, paper, but then once you really sit down and watch a game, you can tell the effort's not there. The system's really funky. They're just missing a lot, and I just don't think this is the best situation for him. I think he's more of a system player. He benefits, from being around an entire coaching staff that does have full belief in him. And I think, there are a couple teams, and I think you mentioned one of them. I think the Lakers would probably be one. It just depends on, what Atlanta's asking for him. And I'm sure it's going to be higher because they do want to recoup some of the assets that they definitely lost. And I think that's rightfully so because I think DeJounte Murray's a great player. It's just the system and the fit for Atlanta just not going to work out because I think just him and Trae Young is just not a good fit.
Yeah, I think that's ultimately what it comes down to. I
Yeah.
think Atlanta probably just made a move that ultimately wasn't the right move. I mean, again, like he's a good player,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't think he's quite good enough to be like, to take Atlanta from what it was before, right, to another tier, right? Because
Right.
they had come off of a disappointing season, before they got him. And, he can help a team, but is he enough of a difference maker to take like a mediocre team to like being like a really, really good team?
Right.
Like you said, he's probably the type of guy, system-ish type of guy where it makes sense to put him into an already established system that already has talent,
Yes.
built in, right? Like other stars, right, that are a little bit better than Trae Young. And that's
Yes.
probably where, like you said, a Philly with an Embiid
And at
and a
different
Max.
positions too. You know,
Right, yeah.
like I don't think he's gonna work with like an elite point guard or like an elite two guard. I think he's probably gonna work better with like an elite forward and definitely an elite big man. So that's kind of where I stand. Like he's just more of like he's just gonna benefit with players that are better than him in other positions.
Right, yeah, yeah, because that's the thing. He probably shouldn't be. If he's your second best player, it's probably not going to be that great of a team.
Right.
I mean, some of it, I guess, probably depends on like who the best player is. Like, I guess if it's like Jokic and then it's DeJounte Murray, okay. But then at the same time, who are the guys after that? That's the issue. You know
Right.
what I mean? Like, I don't like you said. I think he's a good player, but
Yeah.
but probably not quite impactful enough to where if you're Atlanta, you feel good about the trade you made.
Yeah.
And then we get into the other guys, right? Bogdanovich, right? The guard type guy that comes
Mm-hmm.
off the bench. Who's been playing pretty well as a sixth man. Obviously is a good scorer, right? He can shoot pretty well. Um, Now he's 31, right? So he's a little bit older, right? But still can play, obviously. Again, averaging just about 18 a game off the bench. So I don't know if he would be a starter on every team. I think there are some teams that he could start because again, he can bring some offense. But at the same time, if a team was trading for him, I do kind of wonder like what would his role be? Would it be as a starter, or would it be as a guy off the bench? Because I feel like he is probably closer to like one of those microwave plus scorers
Hmm.
where like he's a good scorer. But like you said, but well, not like you said, but I'm just thinking like he probably just fits better as a 6-man type
Yeah.
role. I don't know if I want him starting on my team unless I have like, unless like I have a lot of talent at other positions, and then it's like I can put him out there, because he's not like a great defender. He's mainly a scorer, and he's a good one. It's just again, I feel like it's probably the role that Atlanta has him in is probably about where you would like him to be on a contending team. Um, just because again, just I don't know. Like I think he's fine, but I don't know. I think he's just okay.
Yeah, and it's like I feel like with Atlanta, we've been questioning them since the off season. They had the questionable pick of Kobe Buffkin, which might
Yeah.
pay off because if DeJounte Murray's gone, he gets an opportunity, so that could pay off. But like you were
Right.
talking about with Bogdanovich, that's another system guy. I think he's one of those guys that's gonna come into the game, spark plug, boom, like kind of like what Jordan Poole was for the Warriors, where it's like, okay, yeah, he provides that spark where he can give cool like 15, 16, maybe even 20 sometimes, points off the bench or something like that. Like you said, kind of more of a one-dimensional guy. Doesn't really play a lot of defense. Not the most amazing playmaker, but there's some times where he can pass and he'll make the right read. But yeah, I think he's more of a scorer, and I think he does have value. And he's already been moved once, so I think there is a
Yeah.
scenario where he could get moved again, and you get some decent return value for him.
Yeah, and then Clint Capella, right? We know what he is, right?
Mm-hmm.
Rebounder, shot blocker.
Mm-hmm.
He could probably help some teams. Again, we've talked about it before, right? Like, any team that doesn't have like a rebounding, rim protecting center that would like some size, right? Probably would take a look at him. And then DeAndre Hunter, right? That's kind of the other interesting piece, right? Because he's played for Atlanta. He was the fourth pick, I think, right back in 2019, right? That was the
Yeah.
pick. That was the Laker pick that was moved to Atlanta in that AD trade.
Yes.
And he's been, I guess, okay, right? Like I mean, like for the fourth pick, I mean, he probably would like something better. I mean, he's not a bad player, but he's also getting paid like a decent amount of money. And again,
Sure.
he's 15 a game, 4 rebounds, 46 from the field, 40 from three. So kind of, I guess, like a 3 and D ish forward. It's just again, it's like you said, a lot of these guys are guys that aren't star players,
Yeah.
but if they're in another situation that's better than the one in Atlanta, they could probably do better, right? Like if
Yes.
you're a team, that doesn't have or like would like to have some type of 3 and D ish wing, but you can't necessarily get like an elite one, you could probably talk yourself into like, okay, let's take DeAndre Hunter and put him on our team, right? Same
Yes.
thing with Capella, same thing with Bogdanovich, same thing with DeJounte Murray, right?
All
Like
these guys
take
would do
these
very
guys,
well on contenders. I can guarantee that.
right?
But like in
Yeah,
Atlanta, where it's a cesspool of just not, I don't want to say like they're mediocre. It's just the team
right.
itself is mediocre because you have all these guys who are in a similar tier. It's like, no, you need like one elite, maybe two elite, and then those guys together.
Yeah. And like, yeah, the Kobe Buffkin thing is interesting, right? Because he was the 15th pick and he's only played in like 2 games.
Yeah,
So he really hasn't played at all.
exactly.
To be honest. And that's a guy that was, just outside the lottery, that a lot of people like. So, we don't even know really what he is, as of right now because he doesn't play.
Yep.
Despite the fact that the team is not very good. Then another young guy, right? What was it? AJ Griffin, right?
Yeah,
Adrian
huge step
Griffin.
back.
Yeah, he's a guy that has taken, like you said, a huge step back. I mean, he averaged 8 points, what, 2 rebounds last year, 45 from the field, 38 from three. 3 and D, that's fine, right?
Yeah.
6'6", size, decent athleticism. Then this season, he's only played in 13 games, doesn't really play a lot at all, right? And you look at the numbers, right? 9 minutes a game, 2.5 points, 1 rebound, point 0.3 assists, 29 from the field, 32 from three, just not good.
Yeah.
And that sometimes happens with young players, right? We talked about it with Scotty Barnes, in year two. I know it's a different tier of guy, right? But still, like we've talked about it, like the progression for young players isn't necessarily always linear.
Hmm.
So maybe it's a step back and hopefully he gets better. But either way, you'd like to see some more. And that's kind of like you said, that could be the potential silver lining if you move all these guys, that these other young guys, maybe you can see what they've got. They're on cheaper contracts. And then, maybe the path forward after that maybe you could be like a cap space type team and just like, try to sign some other guys, overpay for some other players and just kind of see what you can do. But it is a weird situation in Atlanta. It makes sense that Trae Young and Jalen Johnson are untouchable because they are really good.
Yeah.
Um,
I think a
and
Kongwu
Jalen
should be untouchable too, but I don't know. That might just be me.
said a Kongwu.
Yeah.
Yeah, they just paid him, I think, and gave him an extension, so I don't think he can be traded
Okay.
necessarily right now, anyways.
Gotcha.
So that's my guess is that like if you can move those guys, then it's probably like you move a Kungwu into the starting five, right?
Yeah.
It's Trae Young, it's Jalen Johnson, and then you kind of just go from there and then see what you can do. But
And
I
I
think
think you would
that
get good
probably
returns though. Like from all
yeah,
those
because
guys, that's a good haul.
right.
I think you would get a good haul at least.
Yeah, if you can get like because I think probably the dream is maybe if you can get like one of those teams that we've talked about to maybe take like two of those guys. Because I think the issue with DeJounte Murray is because his contract is kind of small, only like 18-ish million, but relative to what he is as a player,
Mm-hmm.
right? That like if you're Atlanta, maybe you'd be like let's say if you're the Lakers and you're like, we
Okay.
want DeJounte Murray.
Right.
Then they're like, okay, well we'll give you DeJounte Murray, but you're gonna have to give us, whomever plus another guy, and then you have to take on one of these other guys' contract,
Okay.
right? Like, you have to take on like a Bogdan,
Yeah.
excuse me, Bogdanovic, or DeAndre Hunter or Clint Capella, whatever, which one,
Right.
or some other guy that's on the bench that's not making a lot, like a Patty Mills, whatever.
Right.
That's probably what you would have to do because I just have a hard time. Like, let's say if the Lakers got DeJounte Murray, I just have a hard time believing that the Hawks are going to be like, all right, we'll just swap D'Angelo Russell for
Oh no, they're not
DeJounte
going
Murray.
for that.
Yeah, like I don't. Yeah, like I mean, they're asking for Austin Reeves. I don't think the Lakers would do that.
No. It's too much of a
So
fan favorite too. I don't
right,
foresee that. They
yes,
won't make that
yes,
mistake, that they made with Caruso.
right. So I just think in a situation like that, and the same with Philly, right? Like if you're Philadelphia, right? Like it would probably be like, yeah, we'll give you DeJounte Murray and we'll give you whatever some of their role players are off the bench, right? Like Marcus Morris, for DeJounte Murray.
Right. Yeah.
Would they yes, probably not.
No.
So then you would have to be like, all right, well then we'll take on one of your other contracts. So that's where I could potentially see it happening. It's just again, you gave up 3 firsts. So I don't know what Atlanta prioritizes. Do they prioritize getting actual players back,
Or picks.
for those guys? Do they prioritize picks? Do they prioritize young guys? I just don't know. But I think the seller part makes sense because you're not very good, and there's going to be a stretch where you're not going to have your own picks.
Yeah.
So you probably need to sell those guys and recoup some assets or something while you still can, because then you'll be in a position where you don't have a present or a future, and
Yeah.
that would not be a situation that you want to be in if you're the Hawks, who I think when we read out the record, in terms of like the last several years, it's basically 500. So
Yeah. Definition of mid.
yeah, so they got to do something.
Yeah.
I guess of those 4 guys, which one do you think is the most likely to get traded?
Probably DeJounte Murray.
Okay.
I think due to his caliber and stuff, I think he would probably be the most sought out, or sought after, I guess. And then probably, I feel like Clint Capella probably has a lot of value too, just because he's a center that, can defend and rebound for sure. He doesn't stretch the floor at all, but, he is a lob threat. And, I think he does some decent work out there. He's pretty much an instant double-double. It's not like the highest, scoring total, but it's like around 11 and 10, maybe 12 and 10. Right. So, I think he does have value, but DeJounte Murray, I think, is by far probably going to be their most sought after player.
And then, like, what team do you think would be like a good fit for like a DeAndre Hunter if he were to get moved? Because again, he's kind of like in a weird spot where like I think some of his skill sets like are things that teams would want, but then like in terms of the caliber of a player he is he a guy that you want necessarily starting on a good team? I don't know. Maybe he comes off the bench, but like just in terms of like what type of teams like do you think he could actually help a contending team, or do you think it would more so be like let's just trade him to another team that's just looking for somebody, that's like a stopgap player or something?
I could
like,
see them.
Do you think he's good enough to help or start for a contending team? I guess is the
for
question
sure.
I would have.
For sure, yeah. And I would say like 2 examples that I think, I'm not sure if this would work out money-wise, but Philly, maybe. I think that would be intriguing. They have a decent amount of assets. And also Oklahoma City, I think that would be intriguing as well, because we already know that, OKC, they've got a lot of picks, got a lot of guys that could be moved easily, and they also are one of the best defensive teams in the league as well. So I think, adding a guy like that would be interesting.
Yeah, they just need more size.
Yep.
So Yeah. I mean, what if they were like a Capella destination? I don't
I'd be
think.
down. I'd be down for
Yeah,
that.
like I don't know if he's like the type of player that they want because it seems like they have a certain type of player where it's like guys that can
Skill.
do stuff with the ball, guys that
Yeah,
can, some skill. Like it, and it doesn't seem like he would be that. But I do feel like they need at least a little bit more size next
yeah.
to Chet, just so that because again they're all their weaknesses. They're a very bad rebounding team.
That's
So
literally the only thing that I don't like about OKC is their
right, so
rebounding numbers. But like you
yeah,
said, that's due to because their height isn't the greatest. So because I think
right.
what their four is J Dubs. I think it's Jalen Williams, right?
Like you look at the starting five, you got Shea who's a decent
Mm-hmm.
rebounder, Josh Giddey who's a
Okay.
very good rebounder point
Yes.
guard, and then Chet who's fine as a rebounder,
Yes.
and then J Dub and Lou Dort, right? And those guys are kind of
It's tough.
undersized for the forward spots.
Right.
Especially more so Lou Dort, because like Lou Dort, is kind of an interesting guy because he's kind of like a in betweener, right? Where it's like he could guard a wing, but then it's like on offense, he's probably like the guy with the least amount of usage.
Yeah.
So almost like a four kind of at times.
Why do I
So
feel like OKC might just swoop in out of nowhere and just completely steal Siakam?
yeah, like I mean that's a team that we've talked about before
Oh
where
god.
again Oklahoma City is one of those destinations where they have a lot of flexibility because
Yeah.
they have so many picks and some contracts that they could send out. Where a team could talk themselves into, something like that. But then the issue is with Toronto, like they don't seem like they only want picks, like they want actual talent.
Right.
But then Oklahoma City could be like, well, what about Poku or what about Usman Jang? Not that those guys are amazing, but like they're young players and
Sure.
maybe if they were getting opportunities or minutes in Toronto, maybe they would look, better. But then at the same time, if say like a Pokashevsky was great, he'd be playing more just because he would add to the collective size. Even
Yeah.
though he's more like a Chet type of player,
Right.
just in terms of like a tall, skinny dude.
Yep.
So, but yeah, Atlanta I think is a team where I think it will be very intriguing to explore and see what they're going to do. And if what Mark Stein says is true, right, that's a team that I don't think we would have expected, to be a seller at the deadline to all of a sudden, move some guys and, throw them to some other contenders or, whatever team. So I think they will be really something to keep an eye on because it's
Yeah.
not really something I really expected.
Yeah, me neither. But they do need to make moves, so I'm happy that it seems like they're going to be trending in the right direction.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, again, like it all goes back to this is why the trade deadline is always intriguing
Yeah.
because, there's, because a lot of times, it starts off kind of slow where it's like, oh, it does, people are like, oh, teams aren't really going to do a whole lot. And then all of a sudden, just like a tidal wave of stuff, just comes out,
Yeah.
over the last, several weeks. And then, as we get closer and closer, right, we're probably going to hear more. I don't necessarily know, like, just in terms of like just internally, like feeling how many teams are actually gonna be sellers. But again, the Hawks were a team that you wouldn't have expected to be one, and they just haven't been good. So like I feel like that there's probably some other teams that will probably look to do something similar as well.
Yeah, agreed.
Just yeah, just that we haven't thought about, right? Because I wouldn't have thought about Atlanta moving on from a bunch of those guys, but sometimes you have to kind of adjust to the world around you, and unfortunately, the world is telling the Hawks like you're not a very good team.
Yeah.
So I think it would probably do them good to move some of those guys and get something back. Just because, again, like you said, you have to accept that you took the L with the DeJounte Murray
Yes.
trade, and you're just going to have to move on from it, and see if you can recoup something, from somewhere else, and then
Because
kind of
holding
just
on
go.
to it is not going to do any good. It's just going to make
Yeah.
it worse and worse.
The good news is for whoever trades for him, he's on an extension. I know I
Yes.
mentioned his contract is 18 million right now, but then his extension kicks in. Obviously he'll be making more money,
Mm-hmm.
over the course of that contract,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, like you look at it, in terms of his extension, right? And once you get into it, like, by the end of it, he'll be making like, 30-ish million dollars, right?
Right.
I mean, 24 million or yeah, 25 million next year, then 26, then 28, then a player option for 30 million in 2027, 2028. So, I mean, that's a decent amount of money, but again, the price to get him right now isn't really like a whole lot. Like
Yeah.
in terms of like the contract. But like I said, I feel like because he's a good player, they're going to ask for more and then
Yeah.
maybe they'll add something else to that in addition to him. And it may just be salary filler. Like it might not be one of those other guys we mentioned. It could be one of the other players on the Hawks, that's kind of just there. That's not really,
Yeah. Like you were
playing
saying, Patty Mills, like a guy like that.
right. I think I'm pretty sure he's still on the team, right?
Yeah, he's still on the team.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because again, yeah, Wesley Matthews, Garrison Matthews, Bruno Fernando,
Yeah, guys who
Eddie.
DNP every night, pretty much.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that's something that would be kind of intriguing to see.
Yeah,
And then I also wonder, just last thing on the Hawks, then
sure.
what happens with like Sadiq Bey, right? Because I think he's
Big.
in the last year
Yeah.
of his rookie contract, and he was a guy that they, kind of traded for, on at the trade deadline last year, right? Which just kind of came out of nowhere. I remember there was like stuff about, oh, he might be traded. He wants out of Detroit, and
Hmm.
I guess he got his wish. He's
Yeah.
been okay, I guess, but
Underwhelming
you know,
in my opinion for a
yeah, I
guy
think yeah,
asked out.
right. I think kind of underwhelming. So I guess the question is, like, be a guy maybe that gets moved,
Hmm.
like if Atlanta doesn't want to pay him, or maybe like he gets more minutes as a result of trades happening. I don't know. Um, I mean, what do you think about that one? Before we, kind of wrap up with the news and
I
rumors.
mean, I'm a fan of his game for sure, and he's from my area, so always been a fan of the guy. But I think it has its limits. I think we kind of saw glimpses of it, especially in Detroit, but in Atlanta, it's been kind of a poop show in my opinion. The efficiency is it's a little rough around the edges. But last year I thought he played okay, but the problem is, the sample size was so tiny that the stats are kind of inflated. But as you can see, through this season, he's, kind of shooting 43% from the field. It's kind of eh. And then, the three pointers, 33. And, for a guy's game who's kind of predicated on shooting, I'm not too sure how that's going to translate, too well later down the line in the season. I think the percentages will probably drop. And
Right.
then, only averaging 12 points. And, he doesn't really start very often. I think he's only started in 22 of their 34 games. So, I mean, I feel like he'd probably get a change of scenery, but it's just like who's really going to buy in on him? That's the
Yeah.
question. But if he does
Yeah.
end up getting moved, it would be intriguing, and I think he could probably help. Just be a spark plug scorer because I think that's pretty much all he does. And he does rebound. I'll give him that. He does rebound.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the thing. Just because a guy is 6'7" doesn't
Yeah.
necessarily mean he's like an actual 3 and D,
Right.
wing. His
Yeah.
rookie year, 12 a game, 4.5 rebounds, 38 from three. Then the following year, 16 a game, 35 from three, then 36. And then
Yeah.
for Atlanta, shot 40 from three, 47 from the field in 25 games. And, like you said, this year hasn't shot that well.
Yeah.
I think he was one of those guys that had like one of those random 50-point games, right? I think he
Yes.
had, yeah, I can't remember what season it was, but I know he had 50 in a game, I think,
Yes.
a couple of years ago, right?
Yes. I think it had to have
Yeah,
been when he was on
51.
Detroit.
Yeah, had 51 in Detroit in the 21-22 season. He
Yeah,
had
and that
50.
was the one where I think he was in the starting lineup. So,
Yeah, he
and
played
that team was
46.
not good.
Yeah, no, he
Why?
played 46,
Yeah.
47 minutes. So, but yeah, I don't know. Like, it's just gonna be interesting, I think, to see like which teams kind of pop out of nowhere because there's always like one or two teams that we don't expect to do anything at the deadline that end
Sure.
up actually doing something. And I think the Hawks, it feels like they're probably going to be one of those teams because again, I just we talked about them. We thought that they would be better this season than they were, last year, even though we acknowledge that they didn't necessarily acquire a whole lot of talent. You just thought that there would probably be more internal development from some of the young guys, and then also just another year of those guys being together and figuring out how to play together. It just hasn't worked.
Yeah.
So,
It really
um,
hasn't.
yeah. So now we're gonna get into some news and rumors. Um, according to Jake Fisher of Yahoo Sports, right, Kyle Kuzma, right, the Wizards seek multiple first round draft picks. I do think this is another one of those scenarios where the asking price is high right now, and it will probably come down
Hmm.
later. I don't necessarily know if you're gonna get multiple first because it just seems like the teams have kind of moved on from the thought process of we're not just gonna give up multiple first for anybody. I could definitely see a team giving up at least, probably one,
Yeah, that's what I was
for
gonna say.
because he's good and I think he can help out a lot of teams. And I think if you're the Wizards, you should look to explore, trying to see what you can get back from him, mainly in terms of draft compensation. Because again, we've already talked about it. They're in the midst of a rebuild, basically year one of a rebuild that should have already happened, but that's neither here nor there.
There you go.
Um, that's neither here nor there. But either way, you're in year one of a rebuild, and you should look to get some assets, mainly in terms of draft capital, right? Because I don't think a team is going to give back like a really really good player for Kuzma. It's probably more so like we just have salary sitting here that we don't really need, so you can take that. Maybe you can take a first, and then we'll get Kuzma. Um, do you actually think he's going to be traded? I know you're the Wizards fan,
Mhm.
so obviously follow the team much more than I do, but like based off of like, I don't know, just the overall team, like, do you expect like a lot of guys on the team to be moved, or do you probably think like, probably not. Maybe it's more of like an off-season thing
Yeah.
because I feel like he's one of those guys where he could potentially help swing a team's chances, maybe depending on where he goes.
I think he's one. I think he's probably the only candidate as of right now that will probably be moved at the deadline. But everybody else is probably fair game, when it comes to the offseason. I think that's kind of going to be their approach. But they do need to get a first round pick back for him because it would be intriguing. It's like, say, we all know they're going to end up with like a top 3 pick probably this by the end of this season just because of how bad they are, maybe top 5 or something like that. But like, it would be intriguing if they get, one of the, maybe like a contender, because I feel like Kuz is probably going to a contender at that point, or maybe like a upper echelon team where it's like, okay, maybe we're talking about the Kings or something like that. I know he'd been linked to them previously. So, it would be interesting to see if like we get like, like the 20th pick, in the draft or something like that alongside, the top pick. So I think that's what they're probably looking for, a team where it's like, we know that they're going to finish pretty high in the standings, but, they may not win the championship, but they're still going to have a really good first round pick, which is something that the Wizards could possibly use. It would kind of be sad to see him go. I think he's been, our best player, but, if Kyle Kuzma is your best player on a team, I think, the team clearly has some structural issues because I don't think he can really be the best player
Right.
on, a championship team. No.
Yeah.
So it's like, I feel like, he's really good alongside, 2, maybe even 3 better players. So I'm very curious to see where he would go, but I think he's probably going to leave.
Yeah. Um, Next up, John Collins trade options being explored by Jazz ahead of 2024 deadline. So we've been here before.
Yeah.
Right. So John Collins, they traded for him, from the Hawks for, basically nothing, right? It
Yeah.
was like Rudy Gay and some other random expiring contract. So
Yeah.
again, basically it was a salary dump by the
Yeah.
Hawks.
It was a bag of chips and a blow pop.
Yeah. And basically, according to Andy Larson of the Salt Lake Tribune, the team's reportedly been frustrated with his inability to learn Utah's system on both ends of the floor. I mean, you look at his numbers and like they're not necessarily bad, right? Like 14 points, 8 rebounds, shooting pretty well from the field and from 3, 48 and 37 from 3. But then it's like, same issues kind of in Atlanta where it's like not really a great defender. And also not really anything in terms of a passer, right? Utah is one of those teams where again, it's one of those teams that, likes to move the ball around, spread it out, motion offense, right? I mean, with Will Hardy as the coach, 5 out. Um, and he just doesn't really fit that style of team. So I mean, again, like if you're Utah, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, right? In the sense of like, I mean, you took a gamble on a guy that's a decent talent, and it just hasn't necessarily worked. He hasn't fit. But there's probably some other team where he may be a better fit. But at the same time, I don't know specifically what that is. Right there was a time when like maybe a team like the Oklahoma City would have made sense, but I don't think he really fits there either if he doesn't fit Utah, just because again, they would also continue to want guys like that, can move the ball pretty well and not just turn the ball over. But it is interesting with Utah. They've actually quietly been a lot better as of late. I think they've won 7 of their last 10, and they're like half a game back from like 11 or 10 or whatever it
Mm-hmm.
is. So I mean, with the Warriors, it looks like they're going to lose, and then we'll see what happens between the Lakers and the Clippers. Like they
Yeah.
could potentially, get really close to getting back into the play-in. So
Right.
I wonder, what their actual goal is, but it seems like they're kind of dead set on trying to trade for John Collins. It's been kind of like a really weird season for Utah, anyways,
Yeah.
where some of the guys that they were hoping on, to play have played okay. Some guys have been in and out due to injury, right? Like Laurie Markkinen,
Yeah.
right, missed some time due to injury. I know Walker Kessler missed some time due to injury and hasn't played quite as well in his second year. He's coming off the bench. Where like Keontae George, they're trying to find playing time for him. And that's the other thing where they have guys where they would probably like to play them,
Yeah.
but they can't necessarily right now. Like say like Taylor Hendricks, the rookie, hasn't played at all.
Right.
But again, because Laurie Markkinen, he needs to play. John Collin, he needs to play.
Right.
I guess Kelly Olynyk needs to play as well. Walker Kessler. So like that's kind of tough. Where you got guys at the same position that are better. So if you're Utah, you're probably going to need to move some guys. I think John Collins makes sense. I think some of those other vets like Kelly Olynyk, maybe Clarkson, maybe who's another guy on the roster? I guess like, well, I mean, I don't. I mean, after that, like,
I
I
feel
mean,
like that's
I
it.
don't know how many. Yeah, I mean, because I don't think Markkanen is necessarily going to be traded.
No.
I mean, I know you thought he might be, or like it may feel like it, but at the same time, it just doesn't make any sense for Utah to do that. I just don't think it makes any sense because
Yeah.
he's still a good player, and I think like if you're the Jazz, it's kind of nice to at least have a decent starting point. In terms of some of the guys on your roster. Like, there's no real reason to get rid of him unless you just don't want to pay him, and like
Yeah.
maybe you don't want to pay him, but I don't know. To me, it makes more sense at least as of right now to keep him, just
Yeah.
because, because he's really good. But at the same time, I can understand, if you have a guy that doesn't fit your system, and eventually you'll need to pay him if you want to keep him, then you just get rid of him and then find some better fits, or at the very least free up some minutes for some of your other young guys and see if they can figure out and learn the system.
Yeah. Because like, where do you think he would go? Like John Collins? Because I was thinking like a team with like
I don't.
little to no expectations. I was thinking like maybe a team like Charlotte, maybe a team like the Wizards, even, or maybe even like Memphis, something like where it's like. Because I mean, his
Yeah,
value is low. I think it's tanked completely. It might be even lower than last season.
Yeah, my guess is that he's probably not going to go to a contender.
No.
It's probably just going to be like one of those other teams where it's like, hey, we'll take him off your hands. We'll just give you somebody that we don't necessarily want on our roster, and we'll take John Collins. Like you said, maybe like if the Wizards trade Kuzma, right, and they get back some other random contracts, maybe they could be like, well, we'll flip him, we'll flip those players to Utah, and we'll take back John Collins, like you mentioned, or
Yeah.
one of the other bad teams, like I don't know, the Spurs or the Blazers. I'm not saying that that's what they would do,
Right.
but I just feel like he's probably not going to be traded to like a contender. It's
Yeah.
probably going to be that's like either middle of the pack or a team that's just not very good, right? Like it could easily be like a Detroit or somebody like that. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I don't expect him to go to a good team because it's like if he didn't necessarily work out in Atlanta, who was trying to be good, and he hasn't worked out in Utah, right? Like I don't know. He may just not necessarily fit in with a lot of these teams, but I don't know. I mean, because we were pretty high on him, but it seems like he just hasn't worked out in terms of these situations. So
Yeah.
at a certain point, it's kind of hard to just keep blaming the teams.
Yeah. Exactly.
Um, and then after that, I mean, again, we already talked about, Draymond being reinstated. I mean, I guess what do you expect, from him, like, in his return? I mean, like, not necessarily like within game one. I mean, I assume he'll make the team better, but like, do
Yeah.
you expect kind of like a quote unquote new and improved Draymond?
No.
Or do you expect him to probably just kind of be maybe like trying to play the good soldier early on, but then like at a certain point he'll probably, go back to some similar antics. You just never know.
I mean, we already know who Draymond is. That's the problem. I think, he's not going to change overnight. I think that's unrealistic of people, to be asking of him. Like, yeah, you need to just stop being you. It's who he is. The interventions are probably going to still happen. It wouldn't surprise me if he's suspended again, before the postseason or even during the postseason. It would not surprise me. But I think he'll come back, obviously, and, be a enforcer for the Warriors as he has always been. But I think he's going to get in trouble, and I definitely don't think it's going to be the last incident that we see. That's just where I stand on it.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you where I just feel like it was 12 games. It was not even a month, I don't think. So I just have a hard time believing that like that short amount of time is like you said going to change, like
Yeah,
what he's kind of just been like for a very long time. I mean,
yeah,
again, we could be wrong. And then you also wonder like, if the edge kind of disappears, like wouldn't that also maybe take away from certain aspects of his game because he kind of uses that edge, to his advantage, like you said to be an enforcer for the team, to hype up the team when they needed to. Also just for him personally, right? Where it's like, if he's not a guy that, tries to kind of get under the other team's skin, then that kind of negatively hurts, him as well, like in terms of the impact that he brings, because those are the things he likes to do.
yeah.
Um, and then finally, I guess, we gotta, I guess, sort of, congratulate Ricky Rubio on his
Oh,
retirement.
yeah, big
Obviously,
deal.
it's kind of to some rough circumstances. It sounds like he's, retiring to take some time off to concentrate on his mental health.
Yes.
Um, but it is kind of interesting, right? Because the Cavs signed him. He was out for a while. I know he had the ACL injury. I think what was it like a year or so ago. Then he came back and played a little bit, and then he was out for a while. He did mention he's doing much better and getting better every day, so that's good. But it is kind of interesting, right? Because his career, it started off right where he was playing, professionally in Spain, right? He was kind of, looked at as like a next like a next like great, point guard or whatever.
Yeah.
Minnesota drafted him. And I think if you could like redo his career, like if you say like did multiple simulations,
Hmm.
I think there's a version of him that pans out better. I think one of the
Absolutely.
issues was he had multiple really significant injuries as well, right? I think
Yes.
I swear he's torn his ACL like 3 or 4
Yeah.
times. And a couple of times was as a young player when it
Yep.
started to seem like he was kind of starting to figure some things out. I mean, he was never a great outside shooter. He had a couple of seasons where he shot well. That was
Right.
kind of his main weakness was he was just not a very good offensive
Right.
player. Um, but at the same time, right, like without the injuries, maybe there's a world where he kind of figures out some stuff. And he had a couple of stretches where he did play pretty well. Like I know he had a couple of good playoff performances in Utah. And he was kind of like, sort of like a point guard, right, that could kind of do a lot of different things, right? He could pass, he could rebound, he could get a lot of steals. He became a better defender. He just could
Hmm.
never shoot. But, he kind of is like one of those like, what if his career panned out a little bit differently type of guys? Because there are
Sure.
some guys that come in and you just know that they're going to be really good.
Hmm.
Then there's other guys where they come in and you think like, oh, this guy's probably not going to be so good. Then there's some surprises, and then there's some guys where you're like, I think there's a version where if things had panned out differently, it'd be better. And I
Yeah.
think that's what will probably be with him.
Yeah. Like, and I saw interesting like feed because when it was first announced, I saw a lot of people hating on it. Like, why is like this guy getting like so much like why is this getting so much airtime basically? And it's like this guy, he may not be like an NBA legend, but he is a basketball legend because he's been playing basketball, pro basketball since he was 14. 14.
Yeah,
Like, that's a freshman in what, high school? So it's like,
yeah,
I mean, the guy's been playing pro for, pretty much more than half of his life. So,
yeah,
and he played overseas, and the Euro League is a real deal. They have a
yeah.
crazy environment, and he played for, I
They
think it was
already talked about
Bar. Yeah,
right
exactly.
on the podcast. He talked about how good those overseas leagues are. I mean,
Exactly. And like, because of what?
podcast
He
on
played for Barcelona, right?
Rubio. Yeah,
Yeah, so it's like, that's a big deal. Barcelona's no joke. But yeah, his career was pretty interesting. I remember like I think it was like 2K13, the guy would get every steal. And, it
yeah.
may not be realistic to, basketball and, the real NBA, but regardless, I mean, the guy, I feel like he's interesting. And he did turn into one of those vets that played with a lot of, the stars that we have today. I think he played with Donovan Mitchell, Garland. So it's like, it's intriguing. And I think he's
Some of
played with
the
Donovan
guys,
Mitchell twice.
yeah, and he played with some of the young guys in Minnesota, right? Like
Kevin
I'm
Love.
pretty sure, yeah, Towns, Kevin Love, Wiggins. I
Yeah.
mean, I think Levine as well.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. He definitely played with
he,
Levine too. Yeah.
yeah, because he was gonna be part of that Minnesota core. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously, you look back and like, yeah, they messed up because they took 2 point guards famously, where they took him and I think it was Johnny Flynn.
Yeah. Oh,
And
gosh. Yeah.
those guys panned out and both had injuries.
Yeah.
And they took those guys instead of Steph. But yeah, like you said,
Great
he's
passer
still a
too.
yeah, and like you said, he's still a basketball legend
Yeah.
because he was a great, player for Spain. As a young guy, I mean, he was a EuroLeague champion. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, EuroLeague champion, Euro Cup champion.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, so he was a very accomplished, player in terms of what he
Absolutely.
was able to do. There was like a funny moment I think, at the end of the Laker game, like in the locker room, like where they asked LeBron,
Yeah.
after the game. I don't know why, right? Where like
Dumb
I don't know
question.
why. Yeah, like I don't know why they asked him that. I'm guess it was probably to trip him up, but they asked him like, yeah, what do you think of Ricky Rubio's retirement?
Yeah.
And he was like, yeah, congrats to him. He had a heck of a career. And it's like I'm not really in the mood to answer
Yeah.
that. If I don't sincere, it's just because we got whooped again.
Yeah.
So that was kind of just kind
Bad
of
timing.
random. Yeah, yeah, bad timing. But either way, yeah, hopefully, he can continue, to get, the help he needs with his mental
Yes.
health. And hats off to a really,
Yeah.
a really solid career.
It was a very entertaining career, I will say. And like he, I think, had moments where I can't remember what it was or what milestone it was back in Cleveland. I think it
Yeah,
might have been last year. Can't remember what it was, but I know he hit a three, and like everybody was going crazy because I mean the guy is not one of the better outside shooters historically. So it's always nice to see guys just doing their thing and just really playing the game that they love. So yeah, like you said, shout out to the guy for an amazing career.
yeah. Well, that's pretty much it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, let us know in the comments, your thoughts on, all these situations, the Kuminga situation, DeJounte Murray and the Hawks, right? What do you think they should do? I mean, because again, trade season is coming up, right? It's basically here.
Yeah.
I mean, we're at a point now where we could potentially, over the next month, see, a lot of NBA teams make some significant changes, and we're gonna be here for it. We're gonna talk about it, on our podcast, when we come up and record. So, like I said, let us know in the comments your thoughts. We will read them,
Yeah.
at the beginning of the podcast. If you comment, we will shout you out. So continue to like, comment, and subscribe. And we will see you Friday.